Have you ever found yourself alone during a blackout? The world around you eerily quiet, only to realize that someone or something else might be there with you. What if the darkness wasn't just a power outage, but a veil for unimaginable horrors? This chilling story will take you deep into the shadows of fear. Stay tuned and let's dive into the first unsettling encounter. The cold of early March seeped into my bones as I made my way home after a grueling shift at work. Midnight was just around the corner, and the weight of the day clung to me like a wet blanket. The streets were deserted, the occasional flicker of streetlights casting long, ghostly shadows on the pavement. When I finally stepped into the warmth of my house, the relief was almost tangible. I shrugged off my coat, tossed my keys onto the counter, and allowed myself a rare moment to relax. The silence of the house was welcoming, almost therapeutic, as I grabbed a cold beer from the fridge and collapsed onto the couch. The sound of the can hissing open was oddly satisfying. It was one of those moments when the simplest pleasures felt like luxuries, a hard-earned reward for surviving another day in the relentless grind of life. I let my head fall back against the couch, eyes closed, the chill of the beer soothing against my hand. Minutes passed in blissful silence. I didn't bother turning on the TV immediately, savoring the stillness. But the silence began to feel oppressive, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the house. With a reluctant sigh, I reached for the remote and flicked on the TV, flipping through channels in search of something, anything, to distract me. Nothing caught my interest. The more I scrolled, the more irritated I became. News, reruns, infomercials, it all blurred into meaningless noise. I tossed the remote aside, opting instead to enjoy my beer in the quiet. But that fleeting sense of peace was shattered when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The sudden silence was deafening. The faint hum of electronics disappeared, leaving the house cloaked in an oppressive stillness. I sat frozen for a moment, hoping the power would return, but the darkness remained. My house had always been prone to random outages, but this one felt different. I sighed, running a hand through my hair as I rose from the couch. Grabbing my jacket, I stepped outside to assess the situation. The chill of the night air was biting, and the silence was unnerving. Across the street, the warm glow of my neighbor's windows confirmed what I had feared. This wasn't a neighborhood-wide outage. It was just my house. Turning back toward the door, I reached for the handle, ready to re-enter and figure out the issue. But the door wouldn't budge. My hand froze on the handle as confusion turned to dread. I twisted it again, harder this time, but it was locked. "What the?" I muttered under my breath, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold creeping up my spine. I checked my pockets, searching for the keys I'd tossed onto the counter earlier. Realization dawned with a sinking feeling. I'd locked myself out. Annoyance quickly turned to unease as I glanced around the yard, my breath visible in the frigid air. Deciding to check the back door, I made my way around the house, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. But the back door was locked too. My unease deepened. My wife, who was supposed to be asleep upstairs, had a habit of leaving the doors unlocked. The fact that both doors were secure felt off. Then I noticed it. The garden hose, usually coiled neatly by the breaker box, lay sprawled across the lawn. It wasn't just misplaced. It looked as though it had been yanked violently, the nozzle lying in the dirt near the side of the house. My heart began to race as a horrifying realization dawned on me. Someone had tampered with the power. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I approached the nearest window, peering inside. At first all I could see was darkness, but then faint beams of light flickered across the living room. My breath hitched as I watched two figures moving inside, their flashlights sweeping over furniture and walls. They were rummaging through drawers, searching for something. Anger and fear collided in my chest. How dare they? How dare they invade my home while I was standing right outside? But fear quickly took over. I was locked out, my phone was inside, and my wife was asleep upstairs, completely unaware of the danger. For a moment I froze, paralyzed by indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, but what? The intruders were inside, and I was helpless outside. Then, an idea struck me. I bent down, grabbing a handful of rocks from the garden bed. Positioning myself beneath the bedroom window, I hurled one at the glass, the sound echoing through the silent night. Nothing. I threw another, and then another, until finally, the window slid open. My wife's sleepy face appeared, confusion etched across her features. "What are you doing?" she whispered harshly, her voice barely audible. "Hide," I hissed, urgency lacing my words. "There are people in the house. Go to the closet and don't come out until I say so." Her eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, disappearing from view. Heart pounding, I sprinted to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door until a groggy figure appeared. Explaining the situation as quickly as I could, I borrowed his phone and dialed 911. My words spilled out in a frantic rush as I described the intruders, my trapped wife, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. I stood on my neighbor's porch, my breath clouding in the freezing air, straining to hear any sounds from my house. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one more horrifying than the last. Finally, the sound of sirens shattered the silence. Red and blue lights bathed the street as police cars pulled up in front of my house. I ran to meet them, my words tumbling over each other as I explained the situation. They stormed the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but by the time they entered, the intruders were gone. The back door was wide open, and the house was in disarray. Drawers had been emptied, furniture overturned, and countless valuables were missing. But none of that mattered. All I cared about was my wife. When the officers escorted her downstairs, I felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. But the terror in her eyes told me the ordeal wasn't over. She recounted the moments after I had instructed her to hide. Mere seconds after she closed the closet door, she heard heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. Someone kicked open the bedroom door, the sound reverberating through the house. I heard a click, she said, her voice trembling, like a gun being cocked. My blood ran cold. "He just stood there," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I could hear him breathing. He didn't move for what felt like forever. Then, he left. The intruders had escaped, but the damage they left behind was more than physical. The sense of violation, of vulnerability, was something we would carry with us for a long time. If this story left you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like the video and share it with others who enjoy gripping tales. Your support helps us bring more spine-chilling stories to life. After the break-in at my home, my life was forever changed. Sleep no longer came easily, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. My wife and I debated moving, but circumstances kept us tied to the house for the foreseeable future. The sense of unease lingered, but we did our best to carry on. A few months later, life took another unexpected turn. Financial difficulties forced me to move back in with my parents. It wasn't ideal, but they welcomed me with open arms. To avoid disrupting their routines, I set up shop in the basement. It wasn't as bad as it might sound. The basement was practically its own little apartment, with a small kitchenette, bathroom, and bedroom. There was even a tiny office space that I used to plan my next steps. My old video game console sat gathering dust, and on restless nights, I'd boot it up for a nostalgic escape. The first few weeks were uneventful. I kept to myself, trying to stay out of my parents' way. They were happy to have me home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was regressing. Living in the basement felt like stepping backward, a stark reminder of the struggles I was facing. Still, I found solace in the quiet of my little retreat. The basement was my safe haven, a place where I could shut out the world and focus on rebuilding my life. But that sense of security was shattered one stormy night. It was a Friday, and my parents were out of town for the weekend. The house was mine, though I spent most of my time downstairs. The storm that night was ferocious, with rain hammering against the windows and wind howling like a mournful ghost. I remember feeling oddly comforted by the chaos outside. There's something soothing about being warm and safe indoors, while the elements rage outside. Wrapped in a blanket, I lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. The power flickered a few times, but I didn't think much of it. Then, with a loud click, everything went dark. The sudden silence was almost as startling as the blackout itself. The hum of the fridge, the faint buzz of the overhead light, all gone. I sighed, annoyed but not particularly concerned. Power outages were common during storms, and I figured it would resolve itself by morning. But then I heard it, a loud, deliberate thud against one of the basement windows. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't the kind of sound you could dismiss as a branch or debris. It was sharp and intentional, like someone or something had struck the glass. Swallowing my fear, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as I made my way toward the window, each step heavier than the last. Rain lashed against the glass, obscuring my view, but as I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A face, pale, rain-soaked, and pressed against the window, it stared back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. My breath caught in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the face vanished into the storm. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Was it a prank? A hallucination? No, it had been real. The fear gripping my chest was too raw, too visceral to be anything but genuine. Before I could fully gather my thoughts, another sound reached my ears, the unmistakable creak of floorboards. Someone was in the house. The realization hit me like a freight train. My parents were gone, I had no cell service in the basement, and the intruder, whoever they were, was upstairs. I was completely alone, cut off from help, and at the mercy of whoever had decided to invade my home. I tried to think rationally, but panic clouded my thoughts. My first instinct was to call the police, but without Wi-Fi or cell service, my phone was useless. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of my own helplessness. Desperate, I considered my options. I couldn't confront the intruder. I had no weapons, no plan, and no idea how many people I was dealing with. Hiding seemed equally futile. The basement was small, with few places to conceal myself. Then I heard it, a voice. Low and guttural, it murmured words I couldn't make out. It was coming from directly above me, the floorboards creaking under the intruder's weight. My fear deepened as I realized there was more than one voice. There were at least 2 people in the house, and they were talking to each other. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The intruders seemed unaware of my presence, for now. I needed to act quickly if I wanted to keep it that way. Scanning the room, my eyes landed on the small basement windows. They were narrow and reinforced, but they might be my only way out. Grabbing a stool, I climbed up and inspected the nearest one. It was latched from the inside, but the latch was old and rusted. With trembling hands, I unlatched the window and pushed it open. The storm hit me like a wall, rain soaking me instantly as I pulled myself through the narrow opening. My arms scraped against the edges, but I didn't care. Survival was all that mattered. Once outside, I didn't stop running. Barefoot and drenched, I sprinted through the muddy yard, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between me and the house. My breath came in ragged gasps as I finally reached the neighbor's yard, collapsing onto their porch. I banged on the door until it opened, the startled homeowner staring at me in confusion. I barely managed to explain what had happened before borrowing their phone to call the police. By the time officers arrived, the intruders were long gone. The house had been ransacked, much like my own during the previous break-in, but this time the violation felt personal. The face in the window, the voices upstairs, they haunted me long after the storm had passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random act. Whoever had been in that house knew I was there. They had targeted me. And the most chilling part, I still didn't know why. What would you do if you were trapped in a basement during a storm with intruders lurking above? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video to help us keep sharing these chilling tales. Months after the incident in the basement, I was desperate to get my life back on track. Living with my parents had been a humbling experience, and I was determined to regain some independence. That's when I landed a night shift security job at a massive warehouse a few towns over. It wasn't the kind of job I had envisioned for myself, but it paid the bills, and the solitude of the night shift was oddly comforting. The warehouse was enormous, with towering shelves packed with inventory and a few loading docks that opened onto the surrounding industrial park. During the day, it was a bustling hub of activity, but at night, it was a different story entirely. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. My responsibilities were straightforward: routine checks, ensuring everything was locked up, and reporting any irregularities. Most nights, I sat in the small security office near the entrance, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone. The silence of the warehouse was thick, almost oppressive, but I didn't mind. But then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday, and the weather had taken a turn for the worse. A storm was rolling in, and the rain lashed against the windows with relentless fury. I kept an eye on my phone, checking for updates on the weather. The idea of driving home in such conditions was unappealing, but at least the warehouse was warm and dry. The shift began like any other. I made my rounds, flashlight in hand, walking the dimly lit aisles. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional creak of metal shelves or the distant rumble of thunder. I had just returned to the security office when the power flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The sudden darkness was disorienting. The hum of machinery, the overhead lights, all of it disappeared, leaving the warehouse in an unnerving silence. I cursed under my breath, grabbing my flashlight and preparing to restore the power. The circuit breaker was located near the far end of the building, in a section of the warehouse I rarely ventured into. As I stepped out of the office, the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the towering shelves and endless rows of crates. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, each step amplifying the growing sense of unease. I tried to shake off the feeling. It was just a power outage, nothing more. But as I moved deeper into the warehouse, the stillness began to feel oppressive. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling against the metal walls, but inside it was deathly quiet. Then I heard it, a loud metallic clatter that echoed through the vast space. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound had come from somewhere up ahead, near the loading docks. It was sharp, deliberate, and completely out of place. My first thought was that the storm had caused something to shift or fall. But as I approached the area, the unease in my chest deepened. The loading docks were bathed in darkness, the faint smell of damp metal hanging in the air. My flashlight beam swept over the stacked crates and pallets, searching for the source of the noise. That's when I saw it. 2 sets of wet footprints leading into one of the aisles. The breath caught in my throat. The prints were fresh, the water still pooling on the concrete floor. Someone else was here. My heart began to race as I followed the trail, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a coworker? A prankster? Or something far more sinister? As I moved deeper into the aisle, a faint whisper reached my ears. The sound was barely audible, like 2 people murmuring to each other in hushed tones. I strained to make out the words, but the voices were too low, their tone urgent and almost conspiratorial. Swallowing my fear, I clicked off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept closer, each step careful and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but I still couldn't make out what they were saying. Finally, I rounded the corner, raising my flashlight to illuminate the source of the voices. There was no one there. The aisle was empty, the crates and shelves undisturbed. The whispers had stopped as abruptly as they had started, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my flashlight beam sweeping over the empty aisle. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something glinting on the floor, a crowbar lying just a few feet away. The sight of the tool sent a chill down my spine. It hadn't been there before. Someone had placed it there deliberately. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I backed away, my flashlight darting around the darkened warehouse. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified by the silence. I gripped the handle of the taser strapped to my belt, the small weapon offering little comfort. Then I heard it again, the metallic clatter, this time louder and closer. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the sound. 2 figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods. One of them held a crowbar identical to the one I had just seen, the metal glinting ominously in the flashlight beam. They stood motionless for a moment, their presence more menacing than I could have imagined. Then, without warning, they began to move. Slowly at first, then breaking into a full sprint directly toward me. Panic overtook me as I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. The sound of their pursuit was deafening, their heavy boots pounding against the concrete floor. I weaved through the aisles, my flashlight flickering as I struggled to maintain my balance. Every breath burned in my lungs, every step fueled by sheer terror. Finally, the sound of their footsteps began to fade. I ducked behind a stack of crates, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The warehouse was silent once more, but I knew they were still out there, searching for me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I made my way toward the exit, keeping to the shadows. When I finally reached the door, I burst outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a lifeline, grounding me as I explained the situation. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the darkened warehouse. But by the time they searched the building, the intruders were gone. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but the memory of that night still haunts me, a reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn into a nightmare. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the notification bell. We've got plenty more spine-tingling stories to keep you on the edge of your seat.